Dr. Hong Gui, CEO of VinAI, one of the leading AI research groups and companies in Southeast Asia, specifically in Vietnam. Welcome to the Data Exchange podcast.
Well, thank you, Ben. And it's my pleasure to be here, and thanks for the invitation.
So very quickly, maybe describe to us, my understanding is there's VinAI, which is your company, but then there's also a larger Vin group. So
Vin
can you
Group,
describe
yes.
to our American audience, what is Vin Group in Vietnam?
Yeah, sure. If you guys in the US, you probably haven't heard about Vin Group, but Vin Group is, it's very popular in Vietnam. It's the biggest private conglomerate, and Vin Group basically has the aspiration to be the Samsung of Vietnam, and it's really doing a lot of things in, investing in the technology, manufacturing, especially. I think that you guys probably heard about VinFast.
And I think people now have heard that some American companies are starting to set up serious manufacturing operations in Vietnam. So VinAI and Vin, so you're completely separate company.
So VinAI is actually under the umbrella Vin Group, right? It's actually one of the company under being funded, and also under the umbrella Vin Groups. We have various other Vin companies as well, and VinFast is definitely one of them. So it's like we're a sister company to VinFast.
And I will, by the way, to our audience, I'll link to your bio, because basically you are like one of the industry veterans. You were in machine learning before machine learning was cool here in Silicon Valley, right? So you've been in various, you worked in various companies here in Silicon Valley, including an outfit out of the Stanford Research Institute that basically led to Siri, right?
That's right. Yeah. So I moved to the Bay Area in 2003, and that's when I joined SRI International, the AI Center. And one of the projects that I did was the Kalo project. So back then, I was the largest AI project funded by DARPA. And one of the outcomes of that project is a little company called Siri that spun off from SRI. And yes, and of course, the rest is history.
Yeah. So who's the? I think I met one of the Siri founders many years ago, Adam.
Probably, yeah, Adam. Yes, he's a good friend of mine.
Yeah. So anyway, so you've been working on machine learning a long time, and then at some point you took on this challenge of setting up VinAI. So what is the mission of VinAI? Is it to publish papers? Is it to kind of evaluate ML and AI tools and assess whether or not they're ready to be deployed in products, or a combination of both? Or what exactly is your mission?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and it also gives me a bit of an excuse to talk about why I left Google DeepMind. I was Google DeepMind in Mountain View, California, about 3.5 years ago, and basically I got an offer from Vin Group and the offer is, why don't you come back and set up an AI research lab in Vietnam? And I was thinking to myself that, wow, this is going to be really interesting, but also very challenging, because as you all know, R&D in AI requires a huge amount of resource and talents. And Vietnam is still a developing country. So I think the big question that I asked myself back then was that, what is it really possible to do this kind of AI R&D in a developing country like Vietnam? So I remember that. So
is this put this in context? Is this before deep learning?
No, this is just 3.5 years ago. So this is at the height of deep learning. Yes.
So at least there. So deep learning is happening. Maybe there's already TensorFlow. So a little.
Oh yeah, of course.
And then their papers are being shared on archive.
Yes.
There's
Yes.
YouTube videos. There's courses
Yeah.
online. There's courses online. So
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yes.
so there's a lot. There's a
Absolutely.
lot of basic building blocks.
Yes. So the basic building blocks are there, right? But still, it's
The
first of all, the
community.
question is about whether it can be done, right? Yeah. So the
Yeah.
community wasn't there, right?
Yeah.
Can it be done? Right. So it's still a big question whether it can be done.
Because
So
a lot of this stuff is at least in the early days is a lot of it is like oral tradition. You have to kind of apprentice inside a group to learn all the tricks of how to build these models, right? So without that, without the kind of the experienced bench, it's hard to build a group from scratch, right?
that's right. Absolutely. So you're absolutely right. Talent is really important, and luckily for us, the raw talents in Vietnam, we ended up having access to really smart people, young, energetic, but they are inexperienced. So it's really key is to be able to put in a group where we have the experienced leaders who knows what needs to be done, and you'll be able to supply the workforce with a lot of the young talents in Vietnam that's really fast and it's really quick and it's really smart.
So did you also recruit other expats to come back and help you staff up the kind of the leadership of this group? And then after that, did you end up setting up an academy?
Yeah, so the very first thing that I did is absolutely like what you said, right? I then ended up hiring the first wave of people at VinAI, primarily people who are expats and having years of experience working outside of Vietnam to come back to Vietnam and join me. And then the next thing is to be able to really unlock the value of these young talents in Vietnam. We're running up what is called an AI residency program, the first of its kind in Vietnam, obviously. We borrow the name from similar program. Back then is already well known in Google Brain. So we basically allow opportunities for the students in Vietnam to be able to come and work with us and just basically jump right in all this research development work that we're doing, and they stay with us for 2 years. And a lot of them have been very successful, managed to really help us to publish the papers in all the top tier conferences and so on, and being a really important part of the research organization.
So what is so when you build a group from scratch, or in many ways, like almost like an AI community from scratch in a country. So what were some of the milestones you set for yourself and your group? Was it first, let's try to see if we can publish papers at top conferences, or what was some of the initial goal, kind of the big goals that you set for yourself?
So really there are three things that we wanted to do, right? So the first thing is we want to be able to see whether you can actually do world-class cutting-edge research in Vietnam, right? That hasn't been done before, right? The second thing is we have to.
How do you measure this one? Is it publishing at top conferences?
That's right. That's correct. Okay. It's publishing at all the top tier conferences, and we maintain a really strict list of conferences that we use to evaluate people.
How much time did you give yourself for this first goal?
I have given myself 5 years, but I think I was fortunate that I was able to work with a really strong and talented team. So even we started in 2019, right? And even during the first year, we've already managed to have our first publication at NeurIPS, which is the most important conference in AI. But fast forward
in the first year. In the
first year, yes, in the first year. And then, fast forward until today, right? The entire research team have managed to publish more than 100 research papers in all the top tier conferences in AI. That includes machine learning, the like of NeurIPS and ICML, which is the International Conference on Machine Learning, and in computer vision, the like of CVPI and ICCV,
So now,
and in natural language understanding. Yeah.
Now you're gonna tell me now you guys are actually, your team is now actually some of them are part of the program committee and referees even for this conference.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And at the beginning of this year, there was a report produced by, I think, a company called Thundermark Capital, and they were coming through all the papers in NeurIPS and ICML in 2021 and 2022. And they produced a list of all the companies, right, after normalizing for authors and so on. And we actually managed to reach the ranking number 20, right? And alongside all the big names in Silicon Valley, in China, in Europe, in Japan, Korea.
From 2019. Okay, so that's goal number one. Yeah. What's goal number two?
Goal number two is actually, to support goal number one is, and also other goal. And goal number two is really training the talents that we know that we will need, right? And I think we've already been really successful with that through our AI residency program. And goal number three, last but not least, and it's really important, is how we can actually translate the cutting edge AI research into actual products that improve people's lives. And that's something that also the team has been working very hard towards as well.
So generally, you whatever we're kind of interested in AI out here in Silicon Valley, the trends that we're engaged with, those are very similar to what you folks are working on, like computer vision, large language models, this kinds of things. Now generative models, right? So.
Yes, generative models, the like of cutting edge techniques in computer vision. For our case, I think we're focusing more on not just the large model, but really how you can actually make the models retain the same level of accuracy, but make them more compact. You can actually try to deploy them on smaller devices, especially devices that can actually be used on the edge.
So how many people have gone through your academy? Number of people, roughly?
I think about 80. 80.
And I imagine some of them may have left VinAI and started their own companies.
Yeah, well,
right?
Some of them was about, I think I would say about 30 of them have left. Many of them actually ended up in PhD programs in the US. And a few of them, joined other companies in Vietnam and also other parts of the world as well.
So in terms of practical systems, models, or applications, so what have been some of the highlights so far from VinAI?
So apart from the research contribution, right? If we're talking about product development, we've looked at a couple of verticals. The first is smart mobility. And the reason why we looked at this is because, unfortunately or sadly, today, it's still the case that many people actually die because of traffic accidents. And if you look at the rate of accidents and death per capita, then it's still much bigger problem for developing countries like Vietnam. But still, it's also a really important problem that needs to be solved for the developed world as well. So in smart mobility, we look at all the reasons why there are so many traffic accidents today, and we've identified these causes in terms of unsafe driving, driving with distraction, driving when drivers are feeling fatigued and sleepy, drunk driving, right? And all of these issues, we know that it can be addressed with AI techniques today. So we've already worked on several products and systems, and some of them actually has been deployed in actual cars to be able to help solving these problems.
And so in terms of software tools, so do you So you probably also look at some of the open source tools that we use out here. And you might have even some people in your team begin contributing to some of these key open source projects, right? So, but have you also started kind of releasing some open source software?
A lot of the product results that we did, we do release our results with the source code as well. I can give you like one of the example is we actually built the first large language models for Vietnamese, and the model is called Phở, and the naming Phở is really taken out of the really famous Vietnamese noodle called Phở,
Yeah,
right? So,
yeah.
yeah, and yeah, it's actually we released that to the community, and
so how
yeah,
would you how would you compare large language models in Vietnamese versus English? Because I'm assuming there's more data in English, right?
That's correct. That's correct.
So
yeah.
how would you compare kind of and I what would be like what would be the benchmarks in Vietnamese in terms of where do you compete with other large Vietnamese language models?
Yeah, so in fact we're the first, right? And when we release novel, there isn't a competitor. But that there are other models, right, that being released by people
Yeah,
who's working on.
the large language models that get built here accidentally learn other languages.
Yeah,
But
exactly. So yeah,
yours
yeah.
specifically is
Ours is
highly tuned for Vietnamese.
correct.
So probably
Correct.
is the
Correct.
best large language model in Vietnamese. So
Right. Right.
do you
Yeah.
mind if I ask you how many parameters?
Oh, so that's unfortunately I don't want to answer this question on top of my head, right? But I'm
Yeah.
sure that if you Google around it, we actually released the model and you can find exactly the number of parameters and so on. It's actually part of the Hugging Face
Okay.
repository. So yeah,
So then
it's available.
So these models require a lot of compute, right? So maybe your larger Vin group has its own cloud and you get free compute, right?
Well, so we actually have some of the infrastructure here at VinAI. So we purchased system from NVIDIA, the SuperPod system. We have, a farm
but
of
still,
GPUs here.
these are not models.
Yeah.
These are not models that where you just kind of carelessly push train, right? So I mean, these are expensive to train, right?
Yeah, so it's expensive, sort of like it's the standard of Vietnam, right? But of course, it's nothing compared to the resources that the big tech companies in Silicon Valley would have access to. So yeah, so we would have to be more selective about what we can train and the kind of resources that we have here, right?
So
I think that's a great trade-off that we had to deal with actually.
So the other area that I've been interested in lately, so I've actually been interested in NLP, computer vision, and then most recently speech technology. So do you guys work in speech as well?
Yes, we do.
Oh,
so
you yourself are like a speech veteran.
Right. I spent some time at Nuance in Sunnyvale. So yes, I was very relatively
this is
this
is pre deep learning speech technologies, right?
I think at that time, we're moving towards a hybrid system. Yeah.
So then, what has VinAI done in the area of speech?
So we've done quite a number of things actually. So the very first thing is how do you deal with the data in Vietnam? So we actually part of a big project to try to collect many hours of speech, especially in Vietnam. There's a problem is that there are so many different dialects depend on the location of people coming from, right? So we actually run quite a big data collection effort in order to try to cover as many dialects as possible. And so that the system is robust, in terms of the recognition rates for people from many different locations in Vietnam. And then we've also, experimented with, okay, what about unsupervised learning? What about self-supervised learning? Can we actually build better speech model without a need for the careful annotation and transcribe
the equivalent of OpenAI Whisper?
Yeah, well, and then many people have also tried to do that, right? So Facebook, for example, also have like.
So what is so the end result being you have the best transcription service?
So we tried to benchmark against the like of Google Assistant, right? And I would say that I think we're quite on par against the performance. There are certain areas that we're better. And in certain areas
how can they be better than you for Vietnamese?
Well, I mean, Google's actually collect quite a bit of data in Vietnam as well.
Really?
Right?
Really?
Yeah. Yep. So I would say that Vietnamese as a language perhaps has not received enough attention in Google, right? And that's actually give us a bit of a chance to compete. Okay. But yeah, it's a formidable competitor.
By the way, one area that I feel is somewhat underappreciated. Well, not underappreciated. Maybe not as doesn't have as much cachet is time series. And so time series is interesting because they're everywhere, and every data team has to work with time series. But then it requires a certain amount of specialization, right? So in other words, you can't just take a data scientist and say, build me the best forecasting model. No, you usually need someone who's kind of immersed themselves in time series, maybe using some of the classic statistical models, because sometimes those are better than the cutting edge ML or deep learning models. And then the tools today that we have, they're getting better. But they're not quite at the point where they can just build great forecasting models for you out of the bat, right? So this is one of my pet peeves, is that this is a type of data that all the data teams have, but then the tools have kind of maybe not as many people work on the tools for time series. What do you think?
Well, I would say that a lot of the signals that we're dealing with, right, speech, videos, they're all time series. And I think
look at, for example, language. You've got these massive model hubs on Hugging Face, right? So very easy for a data scientist to just get an embedding, do something productive. But by the way, the other thing I guess that's singular about time series is that, especially
I just want to say, one thing about time series is that I usually think that the reason why deep neural network and all this AI model is working so well, that's because it actually plenty of redundancy in the data itself.
Right.
So you look at speech, you look at video, right? And if there's just some problem about part of the data, it's okay, right? We can still understand it because there's enough redundancy in the data itself. Right? Now, if you look at traditional time series data, right? I'm not sure that that's the case. You have to be careful, right? Because if you look at the data for a stock ticker, right? Well. So I think it really depends on whether you are in a situation where you would have this characteristic data that will enable that. Yeah.
The measurement is quite exacting, right? So in other words, if I ask you build the forecast, it's quite easy for me to realize, hey, your forecast is no good because I start using it, right? So whereas in some other realms of where we work, maybe it's more forgiving, right? So you miss a little bit of a recommendation, or maybe your transcription isn't as good. I can tolerate, right? But for forecasting, especially if it's important, it becomes a little more high stakes, right?
Well, I think that's okay. I mean, in fact, if we have a really clear loss to minimize, I think that plays into the strength of all the machine learning approach, right? But
No.
I
But
think
I mean, if I just take a regular data scientist, have them do,
yeah,
something so important forecast, then that's a little different than, hey, can you do a little bit of a text mining for me, right? So anyway,
yeah.
so we got derailed there. So you came from DeepMind, right? So you must have some opinions about reinforcement learning.
Yeah,
So,
no,
so
reinforcement learning, I love it. It's a really interesting area.
yeah.
I think I've also been exposed to the goal of realizing AGI when I was at DeepMind, and I think that's a little bit more controversial.
No, but tell me about reinforcement
Mhm.
learning in VinAI. Are you guys starting to dabble in reinforcement learning?
Actually, we've done some of the work in how we can actually try to do reinforcement learning when the observation is really in high dimension, right? And so there was sort of like this approach um, where the hypothesis is that human being, we do have a model of how the world works. Um, and the fact that we actually have the model will actually help us to plan things in advance. And that allows us to actually decide our actions better, right? But the question is how we can actually do this when the observations about the world all coming through images and so on, they're all very high dimension, right? So we've done some of the work where we see how we could actually, first of all, try to embed this really high dimensional observation into a more compact world model. But then again, you have to also learn the dynamics about, how things operate in this more compact world model, and then demonstrates that such a system actually performs better than, just applying model-free techniques and so on. So yeah, that's a lot of fun.
And so then for this kind of work, is it mostly so how do you come up with the projects? In other words, so is it purely research, or do you have some kind of objective from the parent company?
Yeah, so the way we form research projects within our group, we follow two models, both the push and the pull model, right? So the push model is curiosity driven. So we let the researchers to have the freedom to propose the research and then to primarily measure the outcome through publication outcomes, right? And then there's a pull model where I think, fortunately for us, we also have a in-house product development team. Again, they're working on areas like smart mobility, smart edge, and so on, which is deployment of computer vision models on the edge.
Specific problems that they need your
help.
Right,
and those are really like specific problems that would pull in the resources from the research team.
So I'm a researcher at VinAI. How much time do I spend on push versus pull?
I would say that 70% on push and 30% on pull.
I see.
But this percentage do vary. Right?
Yeah.
Depends
and
on the
then
individual.
So it's not set in stone. It could be driven by the individual's interest.
Correct.
So if an individual is more interested in working on product, they're free to do that.
Of course.
Yeah. So then, what are some of the constraints that that still remain for you, having seen both sides of the Pacific in terms of AI research? So both in terms of, I guess, resources, talent, community and so on and so forth. So what are some of the constraints that you still need to work through?
Right. I think the constraints are many. I think we've successfully demonstrated that the kind of really cutting edge AI research that's usually only seen in the developed world, that can actually be done in a country like Vietnam.
And rather quickly, according to you. I mean, so if based on the timeline you laid out, it's quite quick, right?
Yeah, of course. And I think we kind of like inherit um, the speed with the culture of VinGroup, because the VinGroup is also known for its speed of execution. And I actually had planned for sort of like a longer horizon, but when things come together, then we be able to execute really fast. So we can actually do that, right? But the constraints, of course, are many. Right? And I think one of the key thing that we try to solve here is how you can actually pick really high commercial value problem to work on, to be able to really unlock the value of all the work that we've invested in our AI research models, right? And that has its own set of challenges, right? Because again, being in Vietnam, location in Vietnam, we kind of like a little bit further away from the market that matters, which is in the US, in Europe, and so on. But I think this is really interesting because you can actually do this, right? Then the value that you can actually unlock, it's going to be really substantial.
Clearly doable, and I always point to Israel, right? So small country, great tradition in science and math, but from day one, all the startups target the U.S. market, right?
Right. Yes.
Yeah. So it's and you folks have probably, I mean, the population is so much higher, so there's a little bit of a market to start with in Vietnam.
Absolutely, yeah.
Let me ask you this. So as I mentioned before we started, I grew up in the Philippines. And in the Philippines, former American colony, everyone speaks English. So that's kind of a competitive advantage. So is that also a barrier for you in terms of the language barrier?
Yeah. So when before I come back to Vietnam, I thought that the language would be an issue, but it turned out that it's not so much of a problem today in Vietnam. All the young generations are relatively well educated in English, and people can at least understand English pretty well and be able to communicate in English, right? But of course, in order to reach the fluency, then it's not at a native level, but it's at the level where communication is not being hindered.
So as you know, because you've lived in Silicon Valley for so many years, people have this kind of impression of Silicon Valley as its advantage is it's got the universities, Berkeley and Stanford, but also a lot of geeks. But really, when the longer you stay here, the more you realize it's really more than that, right? So it's a complete full stack of people who know HR, finance, product, right? So go to market, but they've done it like 4 or 5 or 6 times, right? So, and then they all kind of want to do it again or invest in other people's companies. So there's all this shared learning across different functional areas. And so this might be something that will take some time in Vietnam. I mean, you will need to kind of have some successful entrepreneurs who will teach other entrepreneurs how to succeed, right?
Right. Yeah. So absolutely. And I think the ease at which we can communicate across borders these days, or even across time zone, right? So I'm from Vietnam speaking to you in the US via Zoom. I think that's going to help a great deal, right? And we actually found out that that during the pandemic, right, our speed of execution, we didn't slow down at all, right? And in fact, we managed to talk to a lot of the people in the US and Europe because they're so used to Zoom conversations. So I think that's actually playing advantage to today having companies in locations like Vietnam, right? But yet we have so many ways to remain in good connection with good people, people in Silicon Valley and so on.
So it sounds like your challenges, your key challenges are no longer technical. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it's less technical. It's more about how you actually grow the organization, how do you go to market, and so on. Yes, so I think that's it's the part that we're working hard towards now.
So is this something that the Vietnamese diaspora here in the Bay Area can help with?
Oh yeah. So of course, I mean, we've had a lot of exchange and people in the US coming back to Vietnam, visit us, giving seminars, talking to us in ad hoc basis and so on, right? But yes, and likewise, some of our residents, as I've said, already end up in PhD programs, all the top universities in the US. And so I think the dynamic is going to be both way, right? I think, being a team in Vietnam, we try to really uphold the standards and the way we work on our products and research and so on. And as the standards is the same as in Silicon Valley in the US, then people will then start talking the same language. It's a lot easier that way.
So by the way, I also chaired a big data conference in Singapore for 3 years. And I did not, so I don't know if people in Vietnam go to conferences outside of Vietnam. There were not a lot of Vietnamese people at these conferences. And then I also chaired an AI conference in China for 4 years, but China is more of a self-contained market. In that conference, it's mostly people from China. But the one in Singapore, we would draw Australia, Philippines, Malaysia, even people from India, because Bangalore, I guess, is kind of close to reasonable flight time to Singapore, but not a lot of people from Vietnam. So do people in Vietnam network outside of Vietnam to the rest of Southeast Asia?
Absolutely. I would bet that if you have a conference today in Singapore, then I'm almost certain that you'd see a big crowd of people from Vietnam. Now, in terms of our attendance in all the top-tier conferences in machine learning and AI and so on, during the pandemic, again, I'm going to go back to the pandemic example, where all of the conferences, went online. It actually became a lot easier for people in Vietnam to participate, right? And all of a sudden, people in Vietnam feel that they're actually part of that global and world-class community, right? And now that these conferences move to hybrid, we can still participate online, which is great, right? But then I think as travel become less of an issue, then you would see more of the people, more of the presence from people actually coming from Vietnam.
So how do you folks assess whether or not? I guess because partly because you work with product groups, but are there besides that? So how do you assess if some line of research, be it reinforcement learning or generative models or whatever, is suitable to be deployed into a national product or service? So what kind of assessments do you do?
Right. Yeah. So first of all, let me maybe start by saying that the way we define a product is, of course, it's market driven, right? So you want to be able to solve problems that make an impact in people's lives. So and that should be driven from the market. Now, when these projects are already ongoing, usually there are a lot of opportunities for optimization in terms of the way we do things, right? And so one of the examples that I could actually point to is the fact that when you deploy these AI models, you see lots of problems that arise in data, right? In particular, you try to form the best training set as possible, but the moment you deploy it into the world out there, then you have to deal with
It always comes back to a pipeline,
distributions.
yeah, or a pipeline.
Right.
Yeah.
Pipeline is really important,
Yeah.
right? But also you have to accept the fact that the distribution that you encounter when the model is deployed is going to be slightly different
Yeah.
from the distribution of training data set, right? So that brings back to a really interesting example about the problems that in academia we call it covariance shift, domain adaptation and domain generalization. And it's just kind of like fortunate for us. This is actually one of the problems that the research group has worked on very early on, right? And at some point in time, we found out, okay, look, I mean, there's this pull, right, and a match. And when we discover that these techniques actually work in practice, and that's when I think you can actually see that there's a huge improvement in terms of how we actually do less in terms of data annotation, save a lot of costs for data annotation, training, curating new training sets, retraining these models, right? All of those costs can actually be minimized a great deal through some of these techniques that the research group has worked on.
And so now that your group is several years old, you must also have your own tools, your own clusters, your own systems for training models, and so on and so forth. Because one of the things that when you talk to people in academia, right? So it's not just lack of data or lack of compute. It's also lack of distributed systems engineers who can set up things for you, right? So, but now you have several years of that. You have everything in place, right?
Yeah. So very quickly we discovered that I would say the workflow, the platform, how you deal with data is really important. So we ended up actually having to build our own platform to do that. And the systems that we actually build that can actually help us to manage the data better, all the way from data collection to cleaning, and be able to evaluate how well the model will perform, right, in the real world before you actually deploy them. So that there's certain layers of platform that we need to build ourselves, and mostly it has to do with it's sort of like a data-centric framework.
Or even honestly, even training big models at scale, right?
So for training big model at scale, at the moment we use open source, right? Yeah. So we use the open source platform that other people have developed. And as I've said, I think the platform that we're focusing on is mainly about how to manage the data.
Yeah, someone has to set that up.
That's correct. That's correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. So in closing, I'm not familiar with Vietnam's privacy regulations and things like this. So responsible AI. So we're talking fairness, transparency, privacy, security. So are there any specific initiatives coming out of VinAI in these areas?
So actually, VinAI being sort of like the first world-class R&D lab in Vietnam, we've actually done a lot of work in really building the local community here, and also being a bridge between the international AI community and the local community here. And in one of the events that I participated is called AI for Vietnam event, which basically brought together a lot of the academia in Vietnam, also people from industry. And the question that you raised, right? The question that we just asked, what do we do when it comes to data privacy and so on? I was thoroughly surprised and also happy that people thought about this, and they've raised these issues and being very transparent about it, right? And I think this is really important because companies in Vietnam, they also realize that it's important that data privacy is addressed, because otherwise it can't convince the clients to use the services and so on. But I also add that the fact that we're in Vietnam, I think that adds a lot of diversity in terms of the different perspective in how we develop the AI models, and I think more diversity is going to translate to better fairness, and so on. Right.
What
and
about
of course,
what about some of the fashionable topics here, like federated learning, secure multi-party computation, differential privacy? Is this something you folks are starting to think about?
Yeah, so federated learning is actually it's very important for us, especially when we look at how we actually deploy AI on the edge, right? So how we actually collect this data, but perhaps do some of the statistics of this local data repository that we have, and only use all the data to the same location. So yes, that is really important. Yeah, and it just because that I think a lot of the AI deployment going forward is going to be on the edge. So yeah, sure.
And with that, thank you, Hong Bui. This was great. I mean, this is a first for me, talking to someone who went back to my home region and set up a world-class AI research team. Incredible, honestly.
Thank you so much, Ben. Thanks for the opportunity to speak.